Matt Taibbi is awesome. Matt Taibbi writes stories for the Rolling Stones. He is an amazing journalist. And his eye caught the same thing that my eye caught. I did this story the other day because it was so onerous and so atrocious and such a living example of everything that's wrong with MSNBC. And Matt Taibbi does a better job in making it more succinct in regards to the problems. So I want to read just one paragraph that Matt Taibbi did about this Brian Williams story. Brian Williams should lose his job, besides the fact that he's a habitual liar that supposedly gets on air to present truthful opinion. Forget that fact for the moment. Brian Williams literally got on air, and in a story that on itself was ludicrous because they didn't even investigate what Bernie Sanders was saying, they immediately pull in a random Twitter troll who's supposedly anonymous in order to give his perspective on Sanders for something that had nothing at all remotely to do with the ludicrous story they were already doing. And they come away with it that they don't quite understand why Sanders is saying what Sanders is saying. What bias? There is no bias. There's no bias. MSNBC's radically non-biased, completely, entirely non-biased MSNBC, self-described, reality asserts. Let's talk about the bias associated with MSNBC. And let's put that self-described, radically, entirely, completely, non-biased billionaires paying millionaires to give you a particular narrative. And the narrative that those billionaires are paying those millionaires to give you is Bernie Sanders talking about bias sounds like Trump. No bias exists. Welcome to the soapbox. I'm not going to take long on this story, but I love the fact when very smart people hit upon the exact same thing that I myself have noticed. Not to mention I got to it first. Welcome to the soapbox. My name is Jamarl Thomas. This is the Progressive Soapbox. And guys, I'm not going to keep this particular story long because I've done this story before and I don't like to repeat stories over and over and over again. However, this was honors. And that's to put it mildly. There is a stench about this that people are beginning to notice. And it begins to look even more and more absurd for you to look and tell somebody straight in the face that there is no bias in this channel at all. And the people who you're using to do that are entirely the wrong people to do that. And, in some degree, get across exponentially, just in real time, the bias that people are complaining about, while you are simultaneously trying to tell them no bias exists. It's extraordinary. But I love the fact that this segment existed because now I can always go back to one story. There are plenty of these, but I can always go back to one because of how onerous and how absurd this particular one is. I could point to the woman saying Bernie Sanders made her skin crawl. I could point to them going to Neera Tanden, who literally assaulted Bernie Sanders' campaign manager because he brought up Hillary Clinton's ties or that Iraq war vote. Assaulted him for that. Assaulted him for it. They asked her whether there was any bias. She has no idea. I have no idea what they're talking about. Mind you, she got caught influencing the stories to her own Center for American Progress. And they're asking Neera Tanden a story about Bernie Sanders going after Jeff Bezos in the Washington Post while not disclosing that Center for American Progress, Neera Tanden's organization, got $10,000 from that same Jeff Bezos. Radically, completely, entirely, non-biased, self-described, MSNBC. This is what I'm talking about. Take a look at this story. This happened, it was a couple of days ago. They're talking about Bernie Sanders' criticisms of Washington Post. Bernie Sanders made the point that Washington Post is owned by Jeff Bezos. And I have relentlessly criticized Jeff Bezos and his company Amazon, and is it possible that my criticisms have anything to do with the coverage that they give me? Now, some of this can be just issues of class, but some of this can also be that the people who are in that organization organizing themselves around the owner of that company. Sanders is not insane for saying that. This was the newspaper that wrote 16 articles about Bernie Sanders in 16 hours. 16 negative articles about Bernie Sanders in 16 hours. That is difficult to do if you set that out as your mission. If I got up that morning and I say, If I'm Jeff Bezos, I say, look, I want you guys to write 16 negative articles in 16 hours. That will be difficult to do. They pulled it off, all supposedly on their own, which is not entirely, absurd. Brian Williams aired this. He aired this. This came on MSNBC. This is my video of it, but I want you to see the video.
The end. The year was my attention from the political Twitter site called the Horse Whisperer. Oh.
Again, just so we're clear, I just want to be very clear before you hear this part and see this part. His story is ridiculous on its face. They're angry that Bernie Sanders is criticizing mainstream media for the unfair coverage that Bernie Sanders is getting. Their line, been running through CNN, MSNBC, all these groups, is he sounds like Trump when he does this because they don't like being criticized. Problem is, they don't ever really inspect on whether or not there's a legitimacy of the criticism, either from Trump or to Sanders. And I've made the point before that the issue with the mainstream media is mainstream media. You've discredited yourself so much over the years. There was no weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. And even in the sense of Trump, you've screamed on a mountaintop high that Trump was being essentially told by Vladimir Putin what to do. And your own guy said that was nonsense. The discrediting is all on your own. Trump may be onerous, yes. Trump is a flagrant liar, yes. But it doesn't necessarily mean that you gave him a bit of ammo by discrediting yourself. And I hate to tell you this, but making the comparison between Trump and Sanders is a further discrediting of yourself. I understand that your job is to tell people what to think. But people are not that insane. At least I don't think they are. Democrats might be, because this is a Democratic channel. But not everybody is so absurd. This is a story complaining that Sanders is attacking mainstream media. Listen to what Brian Williams does, though. This is extraordinary. Again, a story about Sanders going after mainstream media, and they don't like it, and they want to say it sounds like Trump. But listen to this.
Okay, since this is trending, here's my Bernie story.
This was
Eliza, the tweet from last night that caught my attention from the political Twitter site called the Horse Whisperer. Okay, since this is trending, here's my Bernie story. The year was 2016, and Bernie was already long eliminated from contention. An actual Democrat would have stopped torpedoing the nominee and worked to defeat Trump, but Bernie had books to sell. The end.
Now, he did this on TV. This happened on TV. He was on MSNBC when he did this. A story that was absurd on its face. We don't like Bernie Sanders talking about Washington Post. We're not going to evaluate whether what Bernie Sanders is right or not. We just don't like him saying it. We're going to go with the line that it sounds like Trump. That's the story that they're running with. Fair enough. Before he gets to the story, he brings in a random troll to bitch at Sanders about supposedly not supporting Hillary Clinton. That is absurd on its face right there by itself, meaning they're not supporting Hillary Clinton. But what does that random tweet have to do with the nonsense story you're already doing? Nothing at all. It has nothing to do with it at all. He just wanted to throw sludge. There are a few points with this. Habitual liar. Right off the bat, Brian Williams. The fact that Brian Williams has a job with MSNBC gets across how much they care about what goes on their airwaves. He was suspended for lying. That's the guy who said, I got hit by a rocket-propelled grenade. Never happened. I was at the Berlin Wall when it fell. It never happened. The guy is a habitual, flagrant liar. MSNBC keeps him on their airwaves. Fair enough. Fair enough. He does a story where he's complaining that Bernie Sanders is attacking the media, specifically the Washington Post, a Jeff Bezos owned organization. And not backing this up, having nothing to do with the story, he brings in a random anonymous troll to attack Bernie Sanders, saying that he wasn't supporting Hillary Clinton sufficiently enough. I showed the Rachel Maddow video where Rachel Maddow even kept saying Bernie Sanders was a monster on the campaign trail for Hillary Clinton. Bernie Sanders went to states Hillary Clinton couldn't even be bothered to go to. So there's that. That's the first point. Second point. That anonymous troll is not so anonymous anymore. That anonymous troll is this guy. This guy with that smirk. That's him, right here. Michael Goodman. Now, the wild part about this is this guy is an independent marketer. AT&T, Verizon, HP, General Motors, BMW, Time Warner, Comcast, Pfizer, Abbott Labs, Bristol Myers Squibb. Oh, you mean all of those things and organizations that Bernie Sanders is probably going to go after and considers themselves in a competition against. Meaning, in representing the 99% or the 90% of the population, these are the people that Bernie Sanders has identified as people that he needs to curtail that economic domination that translates into political power. That guy who works for those organizations is spewing nonsense from the shadows. And that's assuming it was from the shadows. It's possible Brian Williams knew exactly who this guy was. Otherwise, why is he using the tweet? And he puts this on his airwaves, allowing an anonymous person from the shadows that's working with these multinational corporations that Bernie Sanders wants to curtail to spew nonsense at that same Bernie Sanders that has literally nothing at all to do with the even nonsense report that flagrant habitual liar Brian Williams was doing in the first place. MSNBC, non-biased, radically, entirely, completely, non-biased, MSNBC. Allowing this guy to spew this nonsense from the shadows. It gets worse. Do you see the people who are sitting here? Notice for the moment the people who he has on that he welcomed to him. Let's see if I can find it. All right. Look at the people who he brought on to talk about this.
The tweet from
a random person.
The tweet from last.
All right, these two people. All right. So one. You freeze. My system's freezing. I'm sorry, guys. All right. So one worked from the Washington Post. One was from the Washington Post. Sanders is criticizing the Washington Post. All right. Let me bring one person from the Washington Post. And the other person was from, all right here. All right. So Williams brought two guests. The first was Eliza Collins, political reporter from Wall Street Journal, which Williams neglected to mention that Sanders had gone after the Journal and its owners, Rupert Murdoch, in his speech, the speech that they're showing. And he also brought Rob Acosta from the Washington Post because you need balance. So just so we're clear, in a story about the Washington Post and about the unfair coverage that the Washington Post is getting and about Jeff Bezos at Amazon, Jeff Bezos owns the Washington Post, he brings on somebody from the Washington Post. He brings on another person from the Wall Street Journal, who Bernie Sanders also criticized the boss of the Wall Street Journal and allowed a tweet from the shadows, an anonymous tweet that ends up being from a guy that essentially worked for all these drug companies and all of these multinational corporations that Bernie Sanders has considered necessary to curb their power. Everybody that was on that network that day, including the people who were tweeting from the shadows, had a dog in the hunt. Not to mention all of them, I've said it before, are millionaires being paid by billionaires to tell you that the world is just a fucking lovely place and that there's nothing to see here and that what we're telling you is the way that you need to understand this information. I find this story to be astonishing, and I love the fact that I'm not the only one that noticed. They considered a tweet by Twitter Rondo, horse whisperer, complaining that Bernie Sanders didn't work hard enough for Hillary Clinton. This, incidentally, is also untrue, but that's an issue for another time. In sum, a $10 million per year anchor for Comcast subsidiary brings on an employee of Bezos and Rupert Murdoch to ask if the press has a problem covering billionaires, and concludes it does not. They confirm the point by using a tweet as a modern equivalent of a man on the street quote itself, an easily manipulated device, but at least it requires human interaction. That's circling the wagons, not testing the hypotheses. The goal, however, is not to test the hypotheses. That's not the point. That's not the goal. The goal is to do exactly what Brian Williams just did. The problem is Brian Williams is so comically bad at his job that he would just be so onerous and over the top that you could just point to this video and saying, this video is everything wrong with mainstream media in this country. And it happens every day and it happens continuously on the airwaves. Just to be clear, Brian Williams literally bought on an anonymous tweet that had nothing to do with anything. The question becomes, did Brian Williams know that person? Meaning, was it anonymous to Brian Williams? If it wasn't anonymous to Brian Williams, if Brian Williams bought on somebody who was paid by Rupert Murdoch, somebody Bernie Sanders criticized, paid by Bezos, somebody Bernie Sanders criticized, and part of these drug and multimedia companies that Bernie Sanders continuously criticizes, in order to ask, is Bernie Sanders right? Are we being unfair to him? And all of them around, paid by the billionaires, looking at each other, perfectly content at being millionaires, paid by these billionaires, saying, we don't know what Sanders is talking about. We don't know what he's talking about. We have no idea. No idea what he's talking about. I mean, he's just complaining for nothing. Is he just complaining for nothing? Perhaps the negativity towards Sanders isn't over Amazon after all. Sanders gets similar treatment from the New York Times, CNN, The Atlantic, and other outlets. Still, the Post's Bernie's fixation stands out. The paper humorously wrote 16 negative pieces about Sanders in 16 hours. Well, it's only humorous because it's so absurd. It's so atrocious that it just goes into the level of comedy. They weren't trying to hit comedy. They were being serious, if that makes any sense. Example, Clinton is running for president. Sanders is doing something else. Bernie Sanders pledges the United States won't be number one in incarceration. He'll need to release lots of criminals. These are stories Washington Post was running. In the Post, 2017 asked readers how Democrats would cope with the Kremlin backing Bernie Sanders with dirty tricks in 2020. In April of this year, it described the Sanders campaign as a Russian plot to help elect Donald Trump. They've run multiple stories about his $575,000 lake house, ripping his socialist hankerings for real estate. For each according to his ability, the paper quipped, to each according to his need for lakefront property. These are choices that they're making and how they run these stories, how they talk about these stories. Washington Post. Apart from being described as a faux Leninist, Russian stooge who wants to elect Trump and mass release of dangerous criminals, what does Sanders have to complain about? Matt Taibbi is an awesome journalist. I love his work, and he tends to be on it. This is not a situation where I need to completely and entirely agree each time the person writes something. He just does an extraordinarily good job in his writings. So if I can boost this work, I try to boost this work, especially when I think he's onto something. Yes, I got to it first, Matt. So there's that. You're late, but I'm glad you noticed. This was atrocious. This was atrocious. Like atrocious at a level that goes into comedy. Extreme checker. Nate Siri tweeted, threatened that if it comes down to Bernie and Biden, important parts of the party will seek a third option like Kamala. Okay, fair enough. There's always a door you got to walk through if you want to get changed, right? Baltazar 228. Let him try. You have nowhere else to go argument just flips on his head, right? They use that argument on us all the time. You have nowhere else to go. You have nowhere else to go. You got to elect this hack that's not going to do anything for you. Well, Sanders gets in. Okay, we got to find somewhere else to go. What do you mean? What do you mean you got to find somewhere else to go? You have nowhere else to go, right? You're going to elect Trump. You're going to elect Trump. The argument works both ways. If they need to seek a third-party option, let them seek a third-party option. That's on them. If they want to elect Trump again. Baltazar 228. This is why I was so frustrated in the Bernie continuing to play patty cake with these people who are going to do this anyway. Yes, they're going. I mean, but look, Baltazar, to be fair to Sanders. Well, 2 points. A, I agree with you. When Sanders got out there and told his audience that they need to elect Hillary Clinton, and that audience literally booed him for a minute, and he had to stand there and take it. They were cheering him the entire way. You can watch it. They were like, Sparty! And then he says, we got to beat Trump. And he was like, yes, we got to beat Trump. We must elect Clinton. Sustained booing. And then to turn around, and what do? He didn't work sufficiently hard for Hillary Clinton. And flagrant habitual liar Brian Williams will literally air that. That's how much, when I make this point that all of these people left their jobs at MSNBC saying the exact same thing. I showed the video yesterday. 3 hosts 3 different hosts of MSNBC, different races, different genders, comes back saying the exact same thing. Editorial control in MSNBC was exerted from the top. I wasn't allowed to cover the Bernie Sanders meeting. That's what what's his name says. It says they fired him because of it. Ed Schultz. And Kristen, what's her name? She just comes up, Kristen Ball, essentially saying they made her clear her stories with management because they didn't like the story that she covered when she was critical of the Democratic Party. Cenk Uygur literally told you need to take it easy on these politicians and was demoted despite his ratings being some of the best for that time slot. Do not believe that the talking head that you're looking at is entirely coming from you from their own perspective. These are millionaires being paid by billionaires to instantiate various narratives and tell you what to believe. That's all it is. That's what media is. They're paid for their service handsomely. Listen to what Uygur talks about when he says, man, it's a lot to turn down. The airport trips, the ability to get in and out, the excess of money, the amount of money that we're going to give me. It's a disincentive for you to break away from those things. Do not believe that that talking head that is getting paid handsomely by billionaires and oil companies and drug companies and all these other things to be a nice talking face to you, to convince you that who you're interacting with is who it is. They're paid spokesmen. They're doing a job. They're doing a job. Pop reality. I think Bernie sees the writing on the wall. He's now in beast mode with the media. He's even called out other candidates and threatened Israel. I saw that. Bernie a guillotine. To be fair, Brian Williams misremembers smearing Bernie. Is that what it is? He misremembers smearing him? And by the way, you're right, Pop Reality. He's trying to win. It's called trying to win. If the media becomes an obstacle, then the media needs to get on the firing line. He's trying to win. And God bless him for doing so. Fuck the media. If they're... Look, man, I am not in this camp that believes you should play patty cake with enemies. And it's not so much that I'm considering the media as an enemy outright, as an out-and-out thing. I consider them problematic in regards to the way they cover various stories. And they seem to be antagonistic to his cause. How do you write 16 negative Bernie stories in 16 hours? Not saying that they're being pushed by this. I don't know if they orient themselves to the owners of the companies. I don't know if this is just people of a particular class. And because they're of this class, they don't really get the nuances and the difficulties of other people in the other various classes. It's kind of like issues dealing with the military are issues dealing with the military. You have 2% of the country, so the rest of the country doesn't all that get involved, despite what is taking place in various countries. I would wager the same thing is true with us. Dick Cheney is okay with gays because Dick Cheney's daughter is gay. If Dick Cheney's daughter wasn't gay, he'd probably out there saying fuck them gays too. John McCain was okay with bombing and killing and maiming pretty much anywhere. Places, even the military was like, okay, we don't need to go there, John. But he didn't like torture. Why? Because he was relentlessly tortured himself. It pertained to self. Issues that pertain to self tend to be closer to home and people tend to care about more. There's a reason why Bernie Sanders' support among college students have gone through the roof. His spike is at its highest point ever. Why? I'm going to get rid of all that pertains directly to them. However, the older generation doesn't care about that as much because that's not one of their issues. So they tend to flock to Biden. The youth go to the person who's going to erase their student debt. Again, it pertains to them. You must understand my point. Mainstream media is of a particular class. They don't have to be told what to say. They orient themselves to that class just by virtue of being part of that class. You have all of these millionaires in double digits, year after year after year after year. Do you honestly believe that those millionaires paid by billionaires have the same life that you have the same pressures and worries and concerns and vulnerabilities that you have? And if they don't have those concerns and worries and vulnerabilities, why do you believe that they can meet you in your issues? They don't talk about those issues. Why do you think they're going to care about those issues? What about a candidate that does talk about those issues? How are they going to deal with a candidate like that, seeing as that's not their issues? You have members of a particular class that essentially own the media. And what they are presenting to you are the concerns of their particular class. Not to mention with the capitalistic effect of they need to make profit, meaning they need to create conflict and controversy. If you look back to the CNN debate, when Bernie Sanders went on Joe Rogan, what did Joe Rogan do? Joe Rogan is an awesome interviewer. He sat there with Bernie Sanders for an hour and talked through pretty much all of Sanders' issues. He could have asked him whatever he wanted to ask him. And if you notice, there were right-wing questions of that, but they weren't done in this kind of mean-spirited way. They were done in a way of, well, these guys say this. What do you say about this? I want to understand. Because Joe Rogan is not overtly political, even though this notion that he's apolitical is nonsense. That thing got like 6 million views. It was trending on like #1 on Twitter. Why? Because you gave the people an opportunity to just hear the guy out. That doesn't happen on mainstream media. When he went to that Fox News debate and he rocked the house in that debate. Why? Because it gave the people an opportunity to ask him questions and actually hear what the guy has to say. You don't get that when you get 16 negative articles in 6 hours. It looks like you're attempting. When you see Brian Williams, the guy who was touching himself over the murdering of people in Syria, when Donald Trump released those weapons without any level of an investigation, when that flagrant habitual liar gets on there and touches his nipples to weapons being fired, shows a random tweet that's not so random at all. Not so random at all. A marketing executive for drug and multinational corporations. Did Brian Williams know that? More likely than not, yes. Otherwise, it is even that much more incompetent that he grabs a tweet. And by the way, he does it to smear the My Bernie Story stuff. The My Bernie Story stuff was trending. It is not a coincidence that he chose a My Bernie Story of that nonsense to present in a story that had nothing literally to do with whatever he was talking about. Don't tell me you're not biased. The MSNBC is an arm of the Democratic Party. That is all it is. All of this faux, non-biased stuff is nonsense. They are every bit as much as an arm of the Democratic Party as Fox News is of the Republican Party. They know who they're hiring, meaning this notion of having to exert editorial control is not something they necessarily have to do all the time because the people self-censor themselves. When they got the job, they know what's up. Before they were hired, they knew what's up. And NBC knew what's up in the person who they were putting into that particular position. In cases where they screwed up and put somebody who was more on the, more of a lefty, they had to have a conversation. And they had to do that on multiple occasions. My point is, MSNBC is a propaganda outlet. Every bit as much as Fox News. Every bit as much as CNN. All media has a certain bias associated with it. The catch is figuring out where. It's not that the information they're not giving is not factual sometimes. It's more the light and the tint that the information is given that gives a perspective that is not necessarily indicative of a larger contextual reality. Hong Kong, for example, in the way that CNN cover it, is a very good example. Balthazar. Most popular politicians in the United States could have said, I'm going to stream town halls, get more views than you, fill up stadiums, beat your appointed candidates. He didn't even have to play their game. But he didn't know that. He didn't know that. I mean, honestly, let's be fair. He didn't know that. Would you have known that? You wouldn't have known that. You're a 70-something-year-old man. I am 40-something years old. 40-something years old. 41, 42 this year. There are things right now that I still do based on something I did 10 years ago. My wife I would see her doing it and be like, oh, there's something new. And I would switch over to the something new. But if you do something a particular way that you've always done, you get accustomed to the way you've always done it. You just get used to it. Things tend to happen incrementally. Things that tend to be radical tend to be some kind of upthing. But usually it's just kind of these minor tweaks. Sanders has been running in a context of media and politics for the last 40 years. It has been the same way for those last 40 years. From the perspective of the individual that's involved in that process, it looks like it has always been that way. It looks like that doesn't necessarily change. It's changing now. It's a changing period. But it's not if you were 18, yes, it makes sense. If you're 70, no, it takes a bit to get to there. But he's starting. He's starting town halls. He's starting to have the YouTube presence and everything else. Those are things that he has started to do. So Balthazar, yes, he didn't have to play their game. Fair enough. But it's hard to know that right off the bat. And I got to be honest, I still think to some degree, you do have to play their game to some degree. I mean, like, you can't pretend CNN doesn't exist. And you can't not get that older audience that still watches that older media. Meaning, you don't have a choice. You still have to deal with that. And I put to you this way. That CNN town hall, regardless of how biased and how contorted those questions were and the way that they were trying to ding him, did him the positive in spades. Because after that debate, he got a bump larger than many of the other people. Depends on the polls, of course. But he got a bump from that. It's not that I like the being unfair to him, so don't misunderstand me. But when he gets the opportunity to defend himself, he usually does so in a really, really good way. But you have a fair point. He doesn't have to play their game. Or at the very least, he doesn't have to play their game as much. He did it in 2016. If he asked staff in 2016 how to, he easily could have. His staff is tech savvy, that is true. Then all the other campaigns, yes, that's true. Hillary Clinton had BB for 2015. That's a fair point. That's a fair point. He had a tech savvy staff. That staff did extraordinary work in regards to getting like an online presence and all this other stuff. That's a fair point. That's a fair point. I guess my point is, though, that it takes a bit. Like, even at 40, I look at this and I think it takes like, there's stuff that happens where it takes me a while to kind of port over to it when I don't realize people are using it yet. Twitter. It took me a while to use Twitter. People are using Twitch now. I've only barely gotten to a presence on Twitch. It takes a while to learn that stuff, but I feel you. It's a fair point. It's a fair point. And yeah, he has to deal with corporate media. I don't think he can completely ignore it, but maybe he can try to undermine its usage. I don't know. But it's a fair point, Bezos. I know where you're coming from, though. All right, I'm going to end this because if I'm being honest, this video was supposed to be all of 8 minutes. If I'm being honest, what time is it? Jesus fucking Christ, we're 31 minutes in. Yeah, this video was supposed to be 8 minutes. All right, I will end this here. Like, share, subscribe. If you come back to this video is going to be massively cut. So I may still get my 8-minute video. But guys, I want to thank you for your support of the channel. This channel's content is brought to you by you. So definitely like, share, subscribe. And if you really dig it and you want to support, you can always do so through PayPal or Patreon. Even $1 helps. And let me make sure I didn't miss anyone. I don't like to miss anyone. I don't want to miss anyone in their donations. And so I just want to check Streamlabs before I leave. All right, guys. Thank you all. And I'll see you guys later tonight. This is going to be a late night for shows. Have a good one.